This is called Ebi Island, or as it's less affectionately known, the Ghetto of the Pacific. And over the course of this video, I think you're going to find that's an incredibly accurate name. I want to tell you a story of one of America's least discussed crimes, the ghettoization of Ebi Island. But I think it's important to note that while this is certainly an American crime, you could also just as accurately frame it as an American solution. Let me give you a bit of background. The first non-Micronesian to ever set foot in the Marshall Islands came from the Empire of Spain. But so deep in the Pacific, with over 1,200 islands, in practice it would still be hundreds of years before most Marshallese would ever actually meet a foreigner. With a hostile population that's living on relatively useless land, it was just as easy for ships to avoid them entirely. And so for hundreds of years, that's exactly what they did. But by the mid-19th century, that had all changed. Good ships and better trade routes opened the deep ocean to more than just famed adventurers. A growing demand for oil and lamps and perfume on necks saw those American whalers pushing out from their harbors in New England, hemming their way all across this great ocean. And alongside them would arrive traders, soldiers, slavers, priests. This era of Pacific history is sometimes referred to as the Apocalypse, as the infertility caused by the incoming syphilis, influenza, and slavery dropped some Marshallese populations to a mere percentage of what they'd once been. And sweeping in quickly behind them came that destructive word of God. Yet as their world fell, another rose, and in stepped Otto von Bismarck. He wanted colonies to show that his newly united empire was now on the world stage like its European peers. So in 1878, he sent soldiers to the Marshalls to, quote, show the islanders the power of the Europeans. And with 18 chiefs befriended or bribed, with England agreeing that this was the best way to keep America's Pacific expansion contained, Europe's superpowers signed a piece of paper, and for the next 30 years, the Marshalls would be his. But a single generation later, in a staggeringly stupid war, meant that the German Empire was all but kaput. And sensing an opportunity, those rising sons of Japan began a vast Pacific invasion, souring all the krauts who'd come before. From Tokyo to Majuro, thousands of islands would soon be theirs. And so, in 1914, like some unstoppable tsunami, in swept the Empire of Japan. By 1920, the Marshalls were officially the most eastern link in that growing empire. They would call their ownership the South Sea Mandate. It was an announcement to the world that they were joining the great powers of the West, both colonially and militarily. And although their mandate would be shorter than that of the Germans, their effect would be far greater, because they saw in these islands far more than just fish and copra. They saw war. By the 1930s, with the American conflict looming on the horizon, the value of the Marshalls took on a new meaning to those Japanese. Long since considered too far from the mainland to be of any true military value, changes in plane technology, just like those ships that had brought the whalers, breathed new death into these islands. No more were they just about fish or coconuts or even a name on the map. From the moment that the world invented the long-range bomber, this would become the great thorn of the Pacific. It remains that way today. Most specifically, the island at the center of today's story, a tiny spit of land known as Ebi. Nearly 15 years before they ever attempted that day of infamy, the Empire of Japan began preparing this tiny little unknown island for the violence it would soon be forced to face. In a country of what was then 10,000 people, the Japanese brought in 75,000. They built airstrips, bunkers, and submarine ports, anything their navy considered necessary. The most important of these bases would be placed across the islands that comprise the atoll known as Kwajalein. Its secondary island of Ebi would become a naval headquarters to be covered over completely in cement. And here the Japanese would station 8,000 troops on top of a Marshallese population of at most a few hundred, a population that by the end of the war would barely comprise 190 people. When the United States attacked Kwajalein in 1944, many of those remaining locals would have had a lot of reason to believe that they were being liberated. After all, that's what they were told was happening. And depending on how you see the world, that is one way to frame this. But for all that propaganda, the reality of that liberation came with some, I guess you could call it, stipulations. As many locals had intermarried with the colonial Japanese, this incoming American empire distrusted these new, questionably aligned subjects, especially those around Kwajalein, which they saw as becoming an important post-war naval base, an American thorn that could protect Hawaii from any future infamy. So despite bringing liberation to the Marshalls on paper, in the atoll where this story is set, it would not just be freedom that America brought, but also segregation. And soon enough, the world would call that legal. In 1954, the UN handed ownership of virtually all Japanese-owned Pacific territories to the United States. On paper, they would do so with requirements for what the US must provide in exchange for that ownership, or as they would call it, trusteeship. But to paraphrase war criminal Henry Kissinger, it's just a few thousand people in the Pacific. Who cares? Now with the Marshall Islands theirs to control, the United States rounded up those remaining people of Kwajalein and had them begin building a new base on the shell of what was left behind by the Japanese. And for a time, that likely seemed positive because it was paid work in a post-war boom. But with that base close to complete, with absolutely no warning whatsoever, those Americans put them all on a boat and sent them across the channel to Ibai, where they were told to figure it out on their own. They'd still be asked for their labor, of course. From now on, in the morning, they'd get on that boat, come toil on the base, and then in the evening, get on that same boat and be forced back to Ibai. They'd lose their ancestral lands, their homes, and the fisheries that had sustained them for thousands of years and be forced onto an island with a monarchy that did not want them there. One that was all too happy to take the bribes, of course, but not too happy to take the people. And in turn, they would be given a job. It would even be a fairly high-paying job by Marshallese standards. It's just that on the island of Ibai, that cash had virtually no meaning. It might have been enough to survive, in a sense, but it was definitely not enough to live. The cement pad that they'd been forced onto that day did not have enough houses, food, or resources for the people that were sent to it. It would have no true sewage system, fresh water, or opportunity beyond what little work that base could provide them. To keep it all legal, they'd pay off the politicians on a capital island hundreds of miles away who would feed some of that money to the local king, but virtually none of it would ever be felt by the people that base displaced. But what were they supposed to do? Fight the American military? They were barely 200 people. Of course they got on the ship. You would too. But as bad as all of that sounds, it's actually so much worse, because those unlucky few weren't the only ones who got corralled here. A few months later, a second group was forced into this island ghetto, the victims of America's atomic bombings. Not the Japanese, I should note, but the Micronesians, the guinea pigs of Rongelap. Arrivals who would only be allowed to stay here for 3 short years. And then in 1957, those same victims would be coerced back to their radiated home and then forced to live there for decades, just so America could test them as they got sicker, to see what happens to people living in a post-nuclear environment without the legal culpability of having done it to Americans. Victims who would only get to leave in the 80s thanks to Greenpeace, whose private navy defied American law and returned them here to Ibai. Many of their descendants still live here today, and they're all still being tested. By the 1960s, with nowhere else to turn, the island's population exploded to nearly 7,000, and by the 2010s, 15,000. Which might not sound like much, but we're talking out of a national population of 42,000 split over 1,200 other islands, which means that despite having few buildings more than a single story, today Ibai is Earth's 6th most densely populated island. The American base at Kwajalein, by comparison, is less than a single % as dense as here. Presumably why the Americans living there call it almost heaven. Okay, so with that little bit of background provided, let's talk about the modern day, about my personal experience here. Ibai barely comprises 1/10 of a square mile. That's about 10 football fields, give or take. I walked the entire thing in just over an hour, and that includes stopping to film this episode, I should note. I'm talking ring road too, not just tip to tip. Modern Ibai is also a young island. Depending on the time of year, between 50 and 80% of Ibai's residents are children. Which isn't just because they have large families, it's that many of the parents are leaving, or for that matter, have left. As part of their deal for control over the Marshalls, the United States has provided their citizens with the ability to legally migrate to the mainland, and with the base's employment at almost capacity, many of them are naturally choosing to do that. It would be fair to say that most of the children in Ibai have at least one parent working in the US right now, more specifically on chicken farms in a small Arkansas town called Springdale. It's the standard way for Marshallese to set up on the mainland, a community they already know, and in turn, it has provided America with an influx of English-speaking workers who are willing to do one of the worst jobs in the country. Today, there are over 15,000 in Springdale alone. That's 1 in every 4 Marshallese alive. But a chicken farmer has very little time for family, and even less money. So for the most part, Ibai's children are just left behind. They're raised by their aunts, their sisters, their cousins, and in turn, the shacks of this island are absolutely teeming with children. The schools are so full here that most kids can only go a few days a week, if at all, and there's virtually no entertainment beyond some makeshift basketball nets and a garbage dump. So no matter what time of day, no matter the weather, no matter what's going on in the world around them, the streets of this island are 10 years old and they are screaming. Put simply, Ibai was never meant to hold this many people. But again, as awful as that sounds, it gets worse. Because for those who've remained here, the diet is unfathomably bad. I've been to over 130 countries, and this is the worst I've ever seen anywhere on Earth. Even if you have the money to buy it, which most don't, the very concept of vegetables virtually doesn't exist here. To eat on Ibai is to eat from a can. So why not fish, you might ask? After all, historically, these are a people whose diet would have almost entirely been sourced from the atoll that surrounds them. Well, it's just unfortunately, the Americans have stolen that too, because every day for the last 70 years, their military has been dumping their waste into this lagoon. And as fish have no way of detoxifying their bodies, the sewage that drains from that base has irreparably poisoned virtually everything that lives here. Although many still do it, everyone knows that eating the fish from this water is a surefire way to get sick. They're definitely not fishing in Kwaj. And what's worse than that even, there's also no clean drinking water. And let me tell you from experience, Ibai is no place to have the runs because the sewage system here barely operates, and when it rains, the entire island floods. When the island floods, the power shuts off. When the power shuts off, so does the sewage. So does the refrigeration. And with the sea level rising, it floods here all the time. Hence, cans. A diet I wouldn't even wish on my enemy. For the most part, from my personal experience, the greatest delicacy you can get in Ibai is knockoff fast food from the American Ferry Terminal on Kwajalein. But having eaten it, I'd give it about half a star. Although now that I say that, there are some vegetables here, not many, granted, but some, because Ibai is simply one part of a larger chain of islands, and just next to here, attached by a road no less, are dozens of relatively empty islands about the same size as this one. They're barely populated any more densely than the Americans on Kwaj, and one of them, set up with the help of foreign aid, contains an experimental farm producing all sorts of vegetables. I met the farmers actually, they were really lovely people. And now that I say that, there's also plenty of clean drinking water. I'm told that there's enough filtration power to cover the needs of these people 5 times over. It's just like with that farm, for the most part, the people of Ibai simply don't have access. And the reason for that is this giant wall. Because the Americans aren't the only ones boxing out the Marshallese, they're also doing it to themselves. This is the compound of the self-proclaimed King of Ibai. Whispers about his actual lineage are a little less certain of that, right? But whether or not he's the true blood of the crown, he's certainly the one who wears it. And as far as I can tell, he doesn't much care for his people. He's just the one who gets the bribes. And in turn, he treats donations to this island's well-being as just another way to increase his own personal wealth, to build up those walls that much further. All the fresh water is his. He controls the pumps. What he doesn't drink, he sells to the other islands for profit. The vegetables are his. The farm is his. Whatever he doesn't eat, he sells at the harbor market for profit. The islands north of Ibai are his, only to be populated by his family. He lives in a giant mansion on a compound with a wall so large you can only imagine the apartments it could have built for his people. Because those bricks are his. He's the ghetto superstar America bribes to keep all this happening, and he's certainly not too concerned about what it means for his people when he refuses to share. There's even a local whisper that the pier extending from his home always has sharks below it. Supposedly, that's where he throws the people who complain about all this, but I suspect that's not actually true. It's probably just he's the only one with food to waste, and why give it to the people? Why not just dump it for the sharks? When walking around here, it's hard not to notice that just beyond the sight of his walls is a garbage dump teeming with children. They aren't there to search for treasure, it's just one of the only forms of entertainment that they have here. And it's hard not to think that without that wall, he might actually have to look at them. Which presents a bit of a conundrum, really, because let's say America did remove him from power, or stopped paying him directly, I should say. That would be removing the cultural heritage of the Marshallese. It would be destroying their freedom. These aren't American citizens, and what's worse to them, they would lose access to their base. In paying him, they're obviously reinforcing a corrupt and selfish monarch, a man whose rule is directly harming all those who live below him. But if they want this base, they have to make that choice. And although it's easy for me to stand here and judge them for paying that money, I know that if they didn't, I'd probably be making this video shaming them for doing the opposite, because that's the trade of imperialism. There's no right way to dominate a people. But all of this said, eBay is not some endless nightmare. To the people who experience it, this is still home. This is the place that they were born, the land that they know. And they truly are, no word of lie, a genuinely lovely people. There's almost no crime here. I've never felt more immediately welcomed than on this island. Hundreds of children and adults came running over to greet me as soon as they saw me, day after day after day. They'd ask me questions, show me their homes, and they gave me a form of respect that I wish this video could provide them in turn. They were lovely, to the person, and I wish I could be lovelier back. What the empires of our world have done here is nothing more than criminal. It might not fit your personal definition, but to me, this is undeniably a ghetto. We brought them an apocalypse and built back a prison. We stole their paradise and returned them cement. We killed their fish, took their water and their culture, and then paid their king to keep them quiet. But as awful as the view might be from the outside, in my personal experience visiting here, the people are nothing less than incredible. Our abuse does not stain them. You will virtually never meet a happier and more open community than this. And despite everything else I've said, that's the part of eBay that I wish to remember.
So you can call it the ghetto of the Pacific, and you won't be wrong, but every kid I met here, still smiling. This is rare earth.